Hello, I'm Bill Patterson for the Bay Area Skeptics. Our next speaker is well known to the skeptical community. He got his medical degree at Georgetown University and currently is neurologist and associate professor of medicine at Yale with specializations in ALS, myasthenia gravis, and other neurological disorders, and is well published. I'm already feeling a bit inadequate. He is known for his neurological blog and is a contributor to the online science-based medicine. Additionally, his skeptical bona fides are quite formidable, putting him in the rarefied air of the likes of Hyman, Gardner, and, dare I say it, Randy? He's the host of the immensely popular podcast, The Skeptics Guide to the Universe, which has been delivering funny and thought-provoking weekly podcasts for nearly 18 years without interruption. He is a CSI fellow and a fellow of the German skeptic group GWUP, which I won't try to pronounce. He's appeared on television shows such as Penn and Teller's Bullshit and Dr. Oz. I wonder how that went. I could go on and on and on about this hero of mine, but I better let the man speak for himself. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Stephen Novella.
Hey, thanks everyone for having me at Skeptical 2022. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person, but hopefully this pre-recorded talk will suffice. I thought I would record it from my studio, give you guys all a glimpse of where I record and edit the SGU. This is my studio behind me. I apologize for the microphone, although I thought you would prefer good audio quality to an unobstructed view of my face, because, you know, why not? So for this talk, this is the first time I'm giving this talk. This is something that's been, percolating for a little bit. I want to talk about, I've been doing the skeptical thing for like over 25 years. What are the topics on which skeptics tend to disagree with other skeptics? I know you're stunned. It does actually happen. It happens quite frequently, in fact. Now, if there was one group of people who you would think, well, they could resolve all differences reasonably with evidence and logic, it would be skeptics, right? We're all supposed to be rational individuals who base our beliefs on logic and evidence. And so we have a massive common ground. We should be able to resolve any disagreements. And I think to a degree that's true. I think it's more true than of groups of individuals who are not dedicated to science and reason, but it's sadly not universally true. To some degree, I was disappointed when I, discovered over my many years the degree to which groups of skeptics and individual skeptics can very strongly disagree on important topics. And so I think, from time to time, we need to turn our skeptical lens towards ourselves. And always one of the primary lessons of skepticism is humility and to be skeptical of yourself and your own beliefs, your own ideas first. So when otherwise good skeptics disagree with each other, that should be a huge red flag. What's going on here? And it's pointing a light, I think, towards maybe becoming even better skeptics, understanding more deeply the things that drive the way we reason and how we believe. And in here, there should be some overall lessons in just how to communicate with each other, how to communicate with the rest of the world. I'm going to start with just some basic principles just to get us a little oriented here. So generally speaking, how do we resolve disagreements? This is the approach that I take, right? First, you identify the specific arguments and all the relevant evidence involved, right? That's just a good place to start. What are the players? Who's saying what? Who's claiming what? What is their evidence? What arguments are they making? So it's critically important to clarify and examine all premises. An unexamined premise or an unstated premise can completely destroy any hope at coming to common ground or an agreement, even before the discussion begins. If two people or two groups are starting from different premises, it's hopeless to really resolve their differences. So that's a critical step in the process. And then you break down the arguments, right? You break them down to their component logic. Does the conclusion flow from the premises and the logic being employed? Is it all reasonable? Is it all fair? Is it thorough? Is anything being left out? You can also explore the philosophical underpinnings of the whole enterprise that you're engaged in. Sometimes what that involves is framing, right? How is the argument itself being framed? Sometimes that's where things go awry. If you are framing a discussion with the incorrect philosophical, idea or umbrella, then again, you're going to be talking past each other, and it's going to be very difficult to resolve your differences. Then when you get down to the nitty-gritty, what's the evidence? Can we agree on what the evidence is? How strong is the evidence? Not all evidence is created equal. This is often where you get into some judgment calls, right? You might say, well, yes, there's conflicting evidence. I think this evidence is more compelling, whereas somebody might think some other piece of evidence is more compelling. Always, this process should be geared towards finding common ground and proceeding from there. If you're not doing that, you're not trying to resolve your disagreements. You're trying to win an argument, which is not what you should be doing. And finally, you need to identify where you're making judgment calls, right? Where your opinion is, your value judgments. And those are things that are not resolvable, really. You just have to identify. It's like, well, I value this, A more than B, you value B more than A. There may not be any objective way to resolve that. And sometimes it's reasonable to agree to disagree. You have to say, well, we have different value systems. We agree on the logic. We agree on the facts, but we come to different value judgments. That's fine. And then at least you understand each other, and you give each other the space to have differences of opinion, right? So there are some topics where even good skeptics can disagree, right? So when I mean good skeptics, I mean people that are following valid logic, being thorough in their treatment of the evidence, not engaging in confirmation bias or motivated reasoning. They're being good critical thinkers, and yet they can still disagree. When is that? Well, the evidence may be ambiguous, or it may be limited. There might not be enough evidence to resolve the disagreement. Or again, you have different value systems. You may value something more than I do. However, we always should be able to agree on established facts, valid logic, and sound reasoning. That should never be a source of enduring disagreement, in my opinion. If everyone's being good critical thinkers, you should at least be able to agree on what the facts are. And if you disagree, think about a process by which you can resolve that difference, if at all possible. There are also some not so good reasons to disagree, differing backgrounds and area of expertise. That comes up a lot. We sometimes, for example, engineers may disagree with research scientists for reasons that are peculiar to their backgrounds, and they have different ways of solving problems and thinking about things. But the reason that shouldn't be a source of disagreement is because all sides, good critical thinkers, good skeptics, should be trying to get out of whatever box they're in, right? If you're looking at something just from the perspective of your background, your profession, your area of expertise, maybe it's not the most relevant set of information to the question at hand, or maybe another expert has something else to offer. And if you listen to each other and respect a more broader sense of knowledge and expertise, then you should be able to then communicate with each other and resolve disagreements. Differing ideologies, that's probably the worst reason to disagree. It basically means you're stuck in a particular way of thinking about something, particular answer to a question, and you are working backwards from that belief rather than trying to work through the evidence and the logic. So when people disagree simply because they have different ideological starting points or backgrounds, to me, that's a failure of critical thinking, which is the next sort of general topic. Just basically, someone's doing it wrong, or both sides or all sides are doing it wrong. And then finally, a lack of humility, because this is probably one of the toughest things for people in general, but also for skeptics, and sometimes for scientists, for experts. When you have a lot of knowledge, you have a process for gathering a lot of information. There's also just the Google phenomenon. We all think we're experts now because we can access so much information at our fingertips. Sometimes we have to remind ourselves that our ignorance is profound. And sometimes you have to step back and say, you know what, I really don't know. There is so much going on here where I could be wrong. I'm just going to back up and just somebody that I otherwise respect or who was generally critically thinking or generally skeptical disagrees with me, I better back up and just really question my position. And the failure to do that could lead to an unresolvable difference that should be resolvable. So that's the basic format here. We're going to talk about some specific topics that, in my experience, I'm going to basically go chronologically, the things that I encountered from the mid 1990s when I got started in activist skepticism through today, the topics that I think skeptics mostly disagree with each other. The first couple actually are a little bit of skeptical inside baseball, where we're talking about skepticism itself. So the knowledge deficit question, right? So Carl Sagan, the brilliant science communicator, definitely my primary inspiration for getting involved in science communication, in A Demon Haunted World and elsewhere, basically said that pseudoscience, I'm paraphrasing, pseudoscience is believed in proportion to ignorance of science. And therefore, he argued, and this was sort of the standard of science communication in the 1990s, we have to get people to be scientifically literate, to understand science, and then belief in pseudoscience will fall away in proportion to their understanding of science. 3 decades later, we now know that this is basically not true, or it's true in an only a limited way, in very specific topics, but it's more not true than it is true. But at the time, this was actually a bit of a conversation, right? There were different skeptics who believed different things. And so this was something about which we disagreed. To what extent is scientific literacy the key, the core of promoting scientific skepticism? The good news is, I'm starting with an easy one. The good news is this disagreement is largely resolved because basically research, right? There has been intervening psychological research in the last 20, 30 years, which has shed a lot more light on the question of, how much is belief in pseudoscience a knowledge deficit problem? And again, we all pretty much agree now on the evidence because the evidence has spoken. It was ambiguous 30 years ago. Now it's unambiguous. It's pretty small. And it's still an evolving question as more research comes in. I think we're happily just tracking what we believe with the scientific evidence. So that was an easy one. In fact, this disagreement was itself a knowledge deficit question. How about that? And it was resolved by more data. But here now, like when I got involved with activist skepticism in the 1990s, I stepped into a raging controversy that has not been resolved within skepticism to this day. But my early days as a skeptical activist was pretty much consumed in terms of disagreeing with other activists over this question of scientific skepticism versus humanism/atheism. Now, these two things shouldn't be at odds. They're really not at odds. And what I mean here is that there were people, most of the people in the movement identified as both, right? As atheists, humanists, whatever, and scientific skeptics. But these overall rational movement, if you will, was divided into basically two groups. You had those who emphasized scientific skepticism and those who emphasized humanism and atheism. And the disagreement over was, what should the focus of our activism be? Now, I'm going to tell you for each of these disagreements what side I was on. I'm not going to be coy about it. And it's in the public record. I wrote multiple articles about it in Skeptical Inquirer and elsewhere. I was 100% solidly on the scientific skepticism end of this equation. Not that I have any problem with promoting humanism and atheism, but the asymmetry here was that the scientific skeptics, all the ones that I spoke to, all the ones that were making this argument alongside me, were saying, do what you want to do. We're not telling you, humanist atheists, what to do. We just want to focus our efforts on what we're good at and what we're interested in. But there were not all, but there were a sizable portion of humanist atheists, again, not rank and file, but who were activists alongside of us, who were saying, no, you should be focusing your skepticism on belief in God and on religious claims, and not on, and you could do the other stuff, but that's way less important than taking on religion. This was a framing issue. Remember I told you about the framing issue, because it's really not dealing with pseudoscience versus religion, because we deal with religion, and there's a lot of pseudoscience in religion. Really, the disagreement was about, well, it was three things, and as you could see on my slides, there was a strategic argument, a philosophical argument, and a pragmatic argument. The philosophical argument is actually the most important one, in my opinion. Philosophical argument is essentially the difference between methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism. So science acts as if there is nothing supernatural, right? It doesn't say, it's agnostic toward the question of whether or not there actually is something supernatural. It just says when you're operating within a scientific paradigm, you can't invoke God, right? You can't say, and then a miracle happens here. You can't falsify miracles, and therefore they cannot be introduced into the scientific process. This is a well-established, long-established philosophical principle. That's methodological naturalism. And as scientific skeptics, we were saying we follow methodological naturalism, and we're agnostic towards any claim, officially, maybe not personally, but as a movement, as activists, science has nothing to say about claims that are unfalsifiable, except for the fact that they're unfalsifiable, which actually, we get to the strategic sort of argument, actually, that's the most cutting thing you could say about a factual claim. It's that it's not even wrong, right? It's not even wrong. It doesn't even get up to bat. It's not within the realm of science. And you can't prove that something supernatural is not true, doesn't exist by definition, because it's a non-falsifiable hypothesis. And you can't disprove, you can't falsify, right, a non-falsifiable hypothesis. So that's where we came to this. Now, every time religion or whoever ventures into the scientific arena, we'll take them on. Absolutely, we'll take on creationism. We will take on ghosts, we will take on any of these things. But we will not let people get away with saying, well, this is my faith. You could say that, but then you're outside the realm of science, which means separation of church and state comes in, etc. You cannot impose that view on other people. So everything that we would want to accomplish, we can accomplish by simply saying that what you're saying is faith and not science and not falsifiable. We don't have to tell you that we can prove scientifically that God doesn't exist and you should not believe in God. It's just, it's not a scientific hypothesis, is unfalsifiable, it's outside the realm of science. So that as a strategic argument, this is where there's ambiguous evidence, right? And we tend to follow what works for us. For my scientific skeptical promotion and activism, I've had a lot of success taking this approach where you don't try to beat people's faith out of them, metaphorically. You give them the tools and they will surrender it themselves when they are ready, when they have they understand that, the tools of critical thinking. If you try to, shame them into not believing in God, that's not going to work. They're going to cling to their faith even stronger. I think that's what my experience tells me. I think there's a lot of evidence also to support that. You can't, there's good, psychological research, for example, that shows that you can't take a belief system, an explanatory system, away from somebody. You have to replace it with something else. So our goal is to replace it with critical thinking and scientific skepticism, not try to take it away without being able to give them something to replace it with in the first place. So from a strategic and from a very pragmatic point of view, again, the other pragmatic element is most of the people who choose to emphasize scientific skepticism are either scientists or they are science enthusiasts, and that's their expertise. That's their strong point. That's what they're good at. And so it's also partly of focusing on what we know and what we are good at, rather than trying to venture outside of our comfort zone, in terms of being an activist. The status of this is that it's partially resolved. It's resolved in that I think we've pretty much won the philosophical argument. Massimo Pigliucci, he's an actual philosopher, got involved with this and pretty much became the standard bearer for methodological naturalism, and I think vanquished all foes. That's my opinion. You could see his lectures and read his books and you could decide for yourself, but I think it's pretty much a done deal in terms of the philosophical argument. So we're left with the strategic and the pragmatic argument, and that's where we essentially have agreed to disagree. We just leave each other alone and do our own things right now, which is basically what we were advocating in the first place. You do your thing, don't tell me how to do my thing. That's basically basically all we were saying in any case. So every now and then it rears its ugly head. Somebody new to the movement, wants to relitigate the whole discussion all over again, but we usually put it down fairly quickly. It's no longer raging within the skeptical movement. So it's mostly resolved, I would say. Interestingly, back in the day, in the early days of skeptical activism in the 90s, early aughts, alternative medicine was actually not universally condemned by skeptics, which is very interesting. And there was a substantial minority of scientific skeptics and skeptical activists, people who came to conferences, etc., who took the what's the harm approach to complementary and alternative medicine. I think that this, the source of the conflict was background and expertise, right? Those of us who have a medical background and are skeptics, we're beating the drum hard for alternative medicine is probably the pseudoscience that causes the most direct and indirect harm. There's a massive, well-financed industry behind it. This is something where we need to focus a lot of our effort. And then there were those who were like, what's the harm? It's placebo effects. Who cares? Let them take it. And they were wrong. Again, I'm going to tell you honestly what side of this equation I came down on. This should be no surprise. Anyone who's familiar with my writing and my podcast. And I think that it took time. It took time to really give people an appreciation for the many layers and levels of harm that believing in magic, even when the thing itself is biologically harmless, like homeopathy. What's the harm of homeopathy? It's a water pill. It doesn't cause any direct harm. It's like, yeah, but when people believe in magic and they're convinced of that magic because they got a placebo effect when they were desperate, then that causes a lot of downstream harm. There's also downstream harm from financing an industry based on magic. And we're seeing that right now. One of its primary proponents is running for the Senate with a well-financed campaign. So alternative medicine finances the anti-vaccine movement. It finances a lot of harmful pseudoscience. So that's just one other layer to the what's the harm of alternative medicine. And this is partly anecdotal, but I've definitely noticed over the last 10, 20 years, at least within the skeptical movement, the what's the harm argument has pretty much faded away. I think we've made our case pretty solidly. So this was sort of a knowledge deficit problem, but it was really more of a thorough sort of your background. Do you have clinical expertise, clinical experience? And it was fairly complicated and nuanced, but over time, I think we've successfully made this point that, it's, alternative medicine is deserving of our attention and priority. So I rate this one as largely resolved. So, hey, we're doing pretty well. We got, 2 resolved and 1 partially resolved conflicts so far. All right, global warming. It's funny to think back now, in the 2020s. But 20 years ago, there was a minority of scientific skeptics, skeptical activists who were holding on to what I would now call global warming denial. Not to pick on anybody. It's not my goal in this talk to pick on any individual. I know Randy, later recanted this view, and he came around as a lot of other people. But this is just as an example of the attitude that was lingered on within the skeptical movement for quite some time. So in 2009, in an article for the JREF, Randy wrote, some 32,000 scientists, 9,000 of them PhDs, have signed the petition project statement proclaiming that man is not necessarily the chief cause of warming, that the phenomenon may not exist at all, and that in any case, warming would not be disastrous. I strongly suspect that the petition project may be valid. So he was basically endorsing global warming denialism. There's no way around that. This was a little bit late in the game, and this led to a fairly rapid backlash. And Randy, to his credit, listened to the critics, listened to the people that he trusted, who said, "Hey, you got to rethink this position," and he changed this position. This wasn't, however, an isolated incident. There was a back maybe more like 2000 to 2005 and 6 in that area, there were not a small number of activists named skeptics who were in this, I'm not so sure about the global warming thing camp. This was pretty clearly a result of ideology. And again, we don't have to be coy here. This was an opinion that was held pretty much entirely by libertarian skeptics. It was ideology. There was no other reason for that, for this difference, for this disagreement among skeptics. It was completely the libertarian skeptics who were late to the game in terms of accepting the scientific consensus on global warming. It took longer to convince them. Now, interestingly, I say lack of expertise, that was also playing a role, but global warming is the topic, the pseudoscience, if you will, that is least due to the knowledge deficit phenomenon. It is not due to a knowledge deficit, which is interesting because that kind of might explain partly why skeptics might have fallen for it, because it wasn't from a lack of knowledge. In fact, in general, people who are global warming deniers tend to be a little bit more knowledgeable about the scientific evidence than people who accept the consensus on global warming, because they spend more time building a case for their denialism, right? People who more knowledge sometimes correlates with greater refusal to accept the scientific consensus, because you feel more empowered to do so because you have a lot of facts at your disposal. The problem is those facts didn't quite reach deep enough to give them a really meaningful expert opinion. When you think about it, in many really nuanced, rarefied areas of science, having a lot of knowledge isn't enough. And in fact, there's evidence to support this, that until you get to a graduate level of understanding within a scientific field, it's not protective against believing in pseudoscience within that field. You have to be at a graduate level before knowledge starts to become protective. And so even as science enthusiasts and science communicators who try to understand a topic as well as we can, we're not at a graduate level in every area of expertise, every area of knowledge. And so we can easily fall prey to this. Now, the status of this disagreement is that it's mostly resolved, because, around this time when Randy was like the last one, really, in a way, like one of the last holdouts. She just got the memo, I think, later than everybody else. But he, around the time where Randy wrote that article, really the skeptics who were holding on to some doubt about the consensus on global warming were coming around to the mainstream skeptical view. So this one was resolved by time. I think part of it is that the evidence just became stronger and stronger and stronger. The confidence in the conclusions of scientists and experts who were saying that global warming exists just became overwhelming. And so even if you had a tweak to the way you look at the evidence because of your starting ideology, it was overwhelming. And then pretty much everyone's on board now. All right, the next one, and partly I'm trying to just be balanced here, but this is pretty much the next one in my experiences chronologically, where I felt that there was a substantial proportion of skeptics who were disagreed with the scientific position, and that was over genetically modified organisms. This surrounded mainly concerns regarding the safety of GMOs, the effect of patents on seeds, on life, on food production, the expense of developing GMO technology, and the environmental impact. Primarily, the arguments against GMOs was an appeal to the precautionary principle. I felt, and many people felt, that it was an inappropriate or excessive appeal to the precautionary principle, an abuse of the precautionary principle, if you will. Now, whereas global warming denial came from the ideological right, GMO denial wasn't exclusively on the left, but especially within the skeptical community, it was primarily from the ideological left. Why is that? Probably because a lot of the anti-GMO activism was coming from very left-leaning groups like Greenpeace, for example, and the anti-corporate messaging of the anti-GMO position resonated more with the ideological left. And so that's, among skeptics, it was the liberal skeptics who were the ones who, had the biggest problem with GMOs and gave the most pushback against it. Now, whereas global warming, interestingly, is dominantly not a knowledge deficit problem, genetically modified organisms, resistance to GMOs is dominantly a knowledge deficit problem. It's one of the issues that breaks the mold, where generally belief in pseudoscience is not a knowledge deficit problem, but rejection of GMOs is. In fact, GMOs is one of the few topics that displays what we call a super Dunning-Kruger effect. Now, I can't go into a long discussion of the Dunning-Kruger because it's a little bit nuanced, but basically the idea is that the less knowledge you have in an area, the more you tend to overestimate how much knowledge you have relative to other people. I know it's complicated. There's statistical, quibbling about exactly what it means, et cetera, but that's basically the phenomenon. Super decay is that, so with Dunning-Kruger, your self-assessment decreases with your decrease in knowledge, but not as much as your actual knowledge does. So the gap between your knowledge and your self-assessment of knowledge widens. But there is still a positive correlation between decreasing knowledge and decreasing self-assessment. Super decay is when that's not true, when the less you know, the more you think you know. It's not just that the gap increases, you actually start, the people who think they know, the people who know the least about GMOs think they know the most. It's really unique among many pseudosciences. Now, why is that? We don't really know. The research hasn't dug down to that level yet, but what I suspect is, and what many people suspect, is that it probably is because there was a dedicated campaign of misinformation about genetically modified organisms. And so people were filled with a lot of misinformation that they mistook for actual knowledge. And Dunning was actually very eloquent when talking about this phenomenon. Dunning-Kruger does not result merely from an absence of knowledge. It results from the illusion of knowledge. That's really what it is. It's the illusion of knowledge that comes from various sources. And one of those sources is misinformation. So then we had people who were vehemently anti-GMO. And the reasons why they were anti-GMO were numerous, and they thought that they were well informed. But in fact, they were filled with curated, dedicated, often subtle misinformation. I can give tons of examples of this. I'll give you a few. One, it was the notion that Monsanto, who was just a convenient entity to demonize, Monsanto sues farmers over accidental contamination. Turns out that never happened. That Monsanto never sued a farmer simply because of accidental contamination. The cases where Monsanto sued to protect its patent was because they were trying to prevent the loss of their patent, that because the other side was arguing, for example, patent exhaustion, that when seeds blow into another farmer's land, they now own those seeds, can grow them, reproduce them, and sell them as much as they want. Essentially, that would destroy all of their patents, right? That's so-called patent exhaustion. That's what they were suing over, the idea of patent exhaustion, not just accidental contamination. In fact, the organic lobby preemptively sued Monsanto for suing farmers for accidental contamination. They lost that case because they couldn't produce a single example of it actually happening in a court of law. So they inadvertently proved that Monsanto never sued anybody simply over accidental contamination. But that was a huge talking point. And even to this day, when I say, what's your problem with GMOs? That's one of the first things that people bring up. Or they say, I don't think you should be able to patent seeds. Like, well, all hybrid seeds or most hybrid seeds are patented. What about them? And not all GMOs are patented. So that's that's an issue that's actually tangential to whether or not something is a GMO. For example, or it causes tumors in rats. Like, well, actually, it doesn't do that, and you have to go through the research. By the time you start tearing down all the misinformation, what happens people give up their anti-GMO stance. This is a knowledge deficit problem that's fixable with information, with knowledge. So what's the status of this one? This one, I would say, is improving. I don't think that we are where we need to be yet. We're trying to undo decades of misinformation before we really got involved in the game, which was, I don't know why that happened, but for whatever reason, before it was really on the skeptical radar, there were organizations like Greenpeace and the organic lobby, et cetera, that were spreading misinformation about GMOs for years, for at least a decade or decade and a half. And so we are starting from way behind. But in the last 10 years, the needle has within the skeptical community has moved significantly. And I think because of just information correcting the misinformation. So that's pretty good. Maybe there was a bit of an ideological motivation to begin with, but it ultimately came down to information, and that was a fixable problem. All right, here's another one. Nuclear power. This is an interesting one because this is more, I think, complicated and nuanced even than the other issues that we talked about. So the question is, do the benefits of reducing global warming from nuclear power, because nuclear power, nothing's a zero carbon source of power because you have to make stuff. You got to make solar panels or pour concrete to make nuclear power plants. But once you have the infrastructure, the production of the power itself is basically carbon neutral. So there's a huge benefit if you're building nuclear fissile nuclear plants in order to displace coal-powered plants or natural gas-powered plants. There's a huge benefit in terms of reducing CO2 production. So we have to put that versus the risk and expense of nuclear power. We also have to compare nuclear to other options like renewables. So how do we resolve these varying things? Is nuclear power worth it in the end? Do we need it? Should we invest in it? Or should we just give it up as too expensive and too dangerous and put all of our chips on the renewable end of the spectrum and whatever geothermal and hydrothermal we could do, et cetera? This is a highly technical and complicated area. This is an area where, although I have an opinion, one I've stated many times, I think the consensus of evidence and experts right now is we probably need nuclear power if we're going to decarbonize our infrastructure as quickly as possible. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, mapped out a whole bunch of different pathways to a carbon neutral energy infrastructure, and pretty much every single one involved nuclear power. They concluded that we can't get to a carbon neutral world or even just energy sector by 2050 without nuclear power. We can't do it. As evidence for that is the fact that countries that are either shutting down their nuclear power plants or just moving away from nuclear have had in recent years to build coal-fired power plants to rely more on coal because we can't get there, at least not anytime soon, purely with renewables. But I get the other side, and again, this is one where I'm willing to completely change my mind. If the experts express a consensus which is different, and I know that even experts disagree on this. I know that there are experts who say, "Hey, we can get there with 100% renewable." And this is one where we get to a little bit of, well, which evidence and which arguments do you find more compelling? And there's a bit of a judgment call here. So I don't think there's an objective resolution to this one. I do think the weight of the expert opinion does fall on the side of nuclear power. Those who are saying we can get to renewable, like 100% renewable, are kind of glossing over the fact that that would involve massive grid storage or massive overcapacity. And they say, well, we'll get that. We'll just build the grid storage. Like, well, can you just assume that and just say we're going to get massive grid storage? What if we don't? The thing is, if 20 years from now, 2035, 2040 rolls around, we put all of our chips on solar and wind, and we haven't cracked the grid storage nut. We're like, oh crap, 20 years ago, we should have built some nuclear power plants because now we're burning coal. And we really have no hope of getting rid of that coal over the next 20, 30 years. it's too late, So, I think this is where the IPCC came down. They said, yeah, we kind of pretty much have to do everything if we really want to do this as quickly as possible, and we really have no other option if we want to avoid the worst outcomes. We're probably 1.5 C is a done deal, but if we want to keep below 2, it's really the only way to get there. Maybe then eventually, we'll get to 100% renewable 20 or 30 years after that when we're decommissioning those power plants. But for the next 20, 30 years, it's the only way to go. Anyway, this is a topic over which I think good skeptics, reasonable, informed skeptics can disagree. I have an opinion about it. I'm trying to track the expertise, the expert opinion as closely as I can, but I am very humble in this area and I am willing to listen to any other reasonable opinion. So the status of this one, I would say, is unresolved, but I do think the needle has been trending in favor of nuclear power as desperation over trying to decarbonize our energy infrastructure gets greater and greater, as it's really obvious that, yeah, global warming is a bigger threat than whatever threat you think nuclear power is. Also, nuclear power technology is improving, and so that is also helping to move the needle. So anyway, we'll see where it is in 5 or 10 years. So my sense is this one is unresolved, but I think moving in the direction of nuclear power. But I might be wrong on this one. All right. This is the last topic. This is the one that is the current status is, in my opinion, raging controversy. We're at the raging controversy stage within the skeptical movement among skeptics. And I've been, at least I've discussed with skeptics in many countries about this. This is not just an American phenomenon. It may be even worse in the UK than it is here, in fact. So what's the source of the conflict? I think it's ideological. This one seems very generational to me. I really do think that the next generation has a very different mix of views on this than the older generation. And I think it's a knowledge deficit problem as well. It's kind of complicated. Views on biological sex are complicated and rapidly evolving. And it's hard to keep, it's a little head spinning and it's hard to keep up, even if you're trying to be as woke as possible and trying to be as progressive and knowledgeable and reasonable and humane. It's all of those things and scientific all at the same time. It's a little bit head spinning to try to keep up with this issue. In addition to that, the medical science is ridiculously complicated. It's very nuanced. It's ethically complicated. And a lot of the research is preliminary. So there's a lot of ambiguity in the evidence. And ambiguity breeds disagreement because you can insert your opinion into the vacuum of hard scientific data. And also, because children are often involved in this question, emotions run an order of magnitude higher. So this is a perfect storm of disagreement, even among reasonably informed, critical thinking, skeptical people. And that's what we are in the middle of right now. Now, I have written about this. Science-based medicine has written about this. I've put my nickel down. And so, again, I'm not going to be coy about what my opinion is. And this is something that I am increasingly trying to educate myself about as much as possible because, knowing enough to have an opinion is different than knowing enough to be an activist on an issue and to promote a specific point of view or to try to communicate the science to the general public. And so I'm trying to get myself up to speed as quickly as possible in areas that, a year ago or 2 years ago, I only had more of a basic understanding. But there's a few areas here. One is just biological sex itself as a scientific question. What is biological sex? I actually have an article that I'm writing about this. So hopefully I'll be publishing this soon. But so look for that on Neurologica, maybe Science-Based Medicine. The idea here is that biological sex is not binary. It's not strictly binary. And what I hear from a lot of skeptics is that, well, biological sex is binary and anything else is ideology. Any other opinion is pseudoscience, it's ideology. The science, if you follow the science, biological sex is binary. The problem is that view is dead objectively wrong. Biological sex is not binary. It's bimodal. What people are doing is they are confusing bimodal with binary. There are only two poles, male or female, but strictly binary requires that there is no overlap in the middle. But bimodal allows for there to be overlap in the middle. And there is lots of overlap in the middle. This is non-controversial among experts. But human biological sex, mammalian biological sex, is not strictly binary. It is bimodal. There are individuals who are intersex. The other angle to the biological sex question is what features that we consider under sexuality and gender is considered part of biological sex. So this is, we're going to think also where people have a difficult time wrapping their head around the issues here. And again, I'm not presenting myself as an expert here. I'm just trying to understand this as best as I can. I'm a physician, so that gives me a little bit of a step up. But there are physicians who haven't wrapped their heads around this issue. So I think the best analogy here is if we go back 20 years, 30 years, and we think about the sexual orientation topic. Is homosexuality a biological function, or is it a choice? Is it purely a social contagion? Is it a personal choice? Is it cultural? Or are people born either heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual, non-binary, whatever? Are they born with their sexual orientation? Mostly, it doesn't have to be 100% or 0%, but is it like dominantly biological? And I think that question has been strongly resolved as, yeah, it's biological. Sexual orientation is biological. It's in the brain. It has to do with the hormones' effect on your developing fetus, et cetera, those kind of things. And there's no gene, one single gene for it. There's a complex array of genes. Some are on the sex chromosomes, some are not on the sex chromosomes, which is why you can't boil this down to any one simple thing like it's the chromosomes. None of that works because it's much more complicated than that. So if sexual orientation, something that's completely behavioral, right? It's in how somebody feels about themselves, who they're attracted to, etc. If that's part of biological sex, why can't gender identity also be part of biological sex? But of course, gender is even more complicated because gender is itself is more of a cultural concept. But we know that biology in the brain interfaces with culture and environment in a complicated way. So perhaps, and the evidence is strongly trending in this direction, gender identity is just as biological as is sexual orientation. And we're having the same debate now about gender identity that we were having 20 years ago, not really, maybe 30 or 40 years ago for critical thinkers, 20 years ago politically in this country. The previous debate about is sexual orientation biological or is it a choice? I don't think gender identity is any more of a choice than sexual orientation. And that's what the evidence so far supports, although the evidence is not as mature as it is for sexual orientation. So, I still have an open mind about how to completely, think about this and account for all of the evidence. But right now, that's the best scientific explanation that we have. That's the best position that we have. So, if gender is part of biological sex, and there's a complicated relationship there, then that becomes part of the non-binary bimodal spectrum of biological sex too. Biological sex includes the primary sexual characteristics, the secondary sexual characteristics, and gender identity and sexual orientation. It's all there. And what we're talking about here is whether or not there is this space in the middle where people are non-binary or non-gender conforming. And is that, a social contagion, or is that just part of the biology of sex? And I think that the evidence is strongly in favor of it, moving in the direction of it's just all part of the spectrum of biological sex. So that doesn't necessarily mean or dictate all of the sub-questions about how we should optimally approach healthcare of trans identifying individuals, but we have to at least start with good science. And if you're starting from a false scientific premise that biological sex is binary, strictly binary, you're wrong. And you're starting from a false premise, and all of your subsequent argumentation and thinking is going to be not valid, not sound. So the second question is the ethics and the medical outcomes of trans healthcare, with the big question being, should trans healthcare be organized around the basic concept of gender affirming care? Again, I think the evidence is pretty strong, at least in that basic question. Yeah, gender affirming care seems to be the way to go. We still have a lot of individual nuances to work out about exactly what the right age is, and specific interventions and all those things. Way beyond this talk to get into the weeds on the details of trans healthcare. But I do think that we're at the point where we could say, yeah, the gender affirming approach is the science-based, is the ethical approach. Just like, taking the gender critical healthcare approach, in my opinion, is similar to conversion therapy for people who are not heterosexuals. And I think in 10 years, 20 years, pretty much that's the way we're going to be looking at it. It's like, yeah, trying to deny people's gender identity was pretty much the same as trying to deny their sexual orientation was 20, 30 years ago. So, but we're right in the middle of it, folks. This is a status raging controversy. There are some of us who are getting in there and trying to first we have to convert ourselves. We have to inform and have this argument among skeptics, among people who say they are dedicated to critical thinking, who we can at least appeal to a common ground, to put aside long-held biases in the way they think, long-held ideology. And again, I'm being humble here. If you think you could change my mind on this, I am open to it, but this is a complicated area. And you have to get up to at least understanding the basic science before you want to wade in on this complicated issue. So what I recommend on this issue is a lot of humility until you get to a pretty sophisticated level in terms of understanding the basic science here and the medical science. And a good place to start is just to find good sources of expert opinion and see what the experts are saying. That's a good default starting position. And then if it rubs you the wrong way, assume you're wrong, or assume that this is outside your area of expertise. Be humble and try to educate yourself on this, because this is one where, in my opinion, as science communicators, we got to get our shit together fast, because this is now being weaponized as a culture war in the greater society. And if we don't have our crap together, then we're not going to be there to the science communication that our society needs to fulfill our prime directive, right? Our core mission, which is to be objective purveyors of scientific and critical thinking information to try to inform the culture debates of our day. Right. So we're kind of behind the times a little bit on this one, but we gotta push forward quickly. All right. Just one more part of my talk. It is the shameless self-promotion portion of my talk. Hopefully most of you are aware of the fact that my fellow rogues and I have a book that we published in 2018, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, named after our podcast. That is a tome of all the critical thinking things that we talk about in the show. Bob J. and I have another book coming out. This is launching September 27th. You can pre-order it now, The Skeptic's Guide to the Future. This was a ton of fun to write. It's geeking out about all kinds of future technology and science fiction. It is a lot of fun. And cross-promotion, Nexus 2022. I know if you love virtual skeptical events, August 5th and 6th, 2022, please join us. We're going to have lots of talks like this one. Thanks again for inviting me to Skeptical. Again, I hope that this pre-recorded talk suffices. I wish I could be there in person. I promise one day I will get out there and be there in person. Unfortunately, just couldn't make it happen this year. So I think I have a few minutes left to chat with some of my fellow skeptics.
Well, and by the way, that wasn't shameless at all. That was perfectly appropriate, I think. Um,
Maybe it was shameful. I don't know.
and first of all, I want to thank you again, Dr. Novella. Can I call you Stephen?
You can absolutely call me Steve. Yeah, nobody calls me Dr. Bell.
All right. Yeah, so thank you again for that talk. It was very, very informative. And we do have a couple minutes, so I wanted to and I already have a bunch of questions here.
Sure.
And so I'm going to have to do some grim triage here. My first one was, you and I have something interesting in common. And that was at one episode that you had, you polled the rogues about your quote favorite skepticism, and when you got around to yourself, you mentioned facilitated communication, which I thought was very interesting, because I've always thought of that as kind of my favorite skepticism too, or skeptical phenomenon or topic. But of course, you and I are both boomers. And we've been around a little bit longer than even the modern skeptical movement has, sort of. And so my first question is, I don't think it was that, because that came to our attention a little bit later, maybe like in the 90s is when I remember.
Late 80s.
Late 80s.
Yeah.
Was there something? What was the thing, or was it many things, and it just kind of evolved? But was there one focusing thing that put you down the skeptical path there? And by that I mean, was it some sort of woo that you sniffed out early on, maybe when you were even a kid, and that just took you down that path?
Yeah, I mean, so two things. One was just love of science in general. Just I've had a love affair with science since I was a young child. But the real critical thinking pseudoscience issue that sucked me into skepticism was the creationism issue. Because even at an early age, one of my favorite sciences was evolution. I read every book on evolution I can get my hands on. I was a big fan of Stephen Jay Gould, read all of his books. Had a pretty good lay understanding of the evidence for evolution. It was a slam dunk home run, scientific theory in my opinion, as far as I could tell, as a young science enthusiast. The idea that there were people who didn't believe in evolution blew my mind. It's like how could you possibly deny the overwhelming mountain of evidence that life on this planet is the result of organic evolution? And then when you start to delve into their arguments, like, wow, they're all utter crap. And it was like a morbid fascination with how could people make these arguments, and sometimes they were just completely lying about the evidence, or they were completely misinformed about the evidence. And so it was just fascinating to me. And by the time you're done wrapping your head around creationism, you're basically a skeptic at that point. I mean, there's pretty much every logical fallacy, every critical thinking principle is at play in the creationism phenomenon. So that was my entry point.
Yes, me too. I even took a class in college. It was called History and Philosophy of Science, Evolution versus Creationism. I was so happy that I was able to get in that class before it closed out. Here's another question. There is a faction of skepticism that does not think philosophy belongs. You cited philosopher Massimo Pigliucci as the torchbearer of some arguments, and your talk centered on the process of skepticism. How do we address the anti-philosophy faction?
That's another one I could have thrown in here. I had to decide, how many little things to include. But that's more of a fringe controversy, but it is there. And so I'm totally on Massimo's side in this thing. Essentially, the debate is, can we answer all the questions we need to answer with science itself? Like, for example, let's get to ethics and morality. Can science answer ethical questions entirely by itself without getting into philosophical reasoning or discussions? And there are some scientists who say, yeah, you can reason your way, evidence your way to ethical conclusions. And Massimo was like, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. You're doing philosophy. You're just not aware of it. And that means you're doing it wrong, or you're at least doing it badly. So you're essentially assuming utilitarianism and then saying, without explicitly doing it, it's your major unstated premise. You're saying, yes, I can prove with evidence that this has a better outcome, and therefore that's the ethical thing to do. But you're doing utilitarianism without explicitly saying so, probably without understanding that you're doing it, and without understanding that there are other options and better options. Utilitarianism is not even the best ethical framework for the philosophy of ethics. And so, again, who are you going to listen to? You're going to listen to the philosophers, or you're going to listen to the non-philosophers when you're talking about the role of philosophy. You have to be a little bit humble here and go, maybe the philosophers know something about philosophy that I don't know. And again, I always try to align my opinions and my beliefs to the relevant experts. And in this case, I've studied enough philosophy. I'm not an expert, no degrees or anything, but I've studied a little philosophy, the philosophy of ethics and just Greek philosophy, etc. I know enough to know, yeah, we need philosophy. Science is based on philosophy. I talked about methodological naturalism. That's philosophy. Science is philosophy. The idea that you're not doing philosophy is just ignorant of philosophy. It's not really even a debate. There's just a few fringe science communicators, in my opinion. They're not necessarily fringe in other ways, but in this way, they're on the fringe, who are making this astounding argument that science can exist independent of philosophy. And I believe their position was utterly demolished by Massimo and other philosophers, and it's done.
Boy, talk about being well prepared for a question. Stephen, was there ever a time when you, I don't want to say that you got something wrong, but there was a time when you were really surprised and it kind of was jarring, and maybe in the realm of pseudoscience or something like that? Because I know, most people have it. I know I have. I've been. GMOs was one where I've kind of come around, and thanks to you and the Rogues, actually. Mm-hmm. Was there something that really kind of took you aback? Maybe it was a long time ago.
Not really, because I tend to creep up on issues. You know what I mean? Like, I don't take a firm position at a stage when I shouldn't. At least maybe in my youth I did. So yeah, when I was in my teens and 20s, when I was coming into the critical thinking point of view, I had tons of things that I was wrong about. I've changed my mind pretty much on everything. But as I settled into more of a mature, skeptical, critical thinking approach to things, I tend to track with the evidence. That's basically the process, right? So there are times when the evidence changed and I changed my mind along with it. Again, in the 90s, I was a knowledge deficit proponent without even knowing it. And then my mind is completely different now because the last 20 years of evidence has changed, For example, I've had a lot of ideas about space travel that I had to change in writing the book because I did research. I'm like, oh, wow. So yeah, we're not going to have artificial gravity anytime soon. Okay, every science fiction movie lied to me. So there's things like that where there's gaps in my knowledge, or maybe I thought I knew more than I actually did, or again, the thing that always, it's hard not to be surprised by this. I try not to be. I try to remember and be humble every time, but it's kind of hard not to be surprised by the depth of your ignorance in an area of knowledge that you're not that familiar with. And then when you get to like, wow, I figured I was ignorant, but I'm way more ignorant than I thought I was. So that kind of thing happens all the time. But there was nothing where I'm like, yeah, this is the skeptical position. I was hard on that, and it turned out to be completely wrong, because I wouldn't have taken that position if it was anywhere likely to be the case. Skeptics generally go after low-hanging fruit. That's kind of where our specialty is the areas that are lacking critical thinking that require it, but they tend to be low-hanging fruit. So I'm not too worried about, space aliens being real at any point, or homeopathy working like those. I don't think anything like that's going to happen.
I just have one more question. You do this podcast week after week after week, and it's always interesting and fascinating. You do your blog. You're a freaking neurologist. You teach. When do you sleep?
Listen, I get this question a lot, so and I'm happy to answer it. What I do is no different than any other academic, seriously. And there are academics who work way harder than I do. It's really nothing extraordinary. It isn't. I have my job. I have my job, and I do what I consider to be my academic activity, which is science communication, public understanding of science. it's, I probably work 60 hours a week, 70 hours a week. That's pretty much what most academics work, if not more. If you're in the lab running experiments, you may be there way more than that. It's really nothing extraordinary. It's just if it's your job and it's on the schedule and you do it and you do it every week and it's just what you do, it's just that's your life. It's just part of what you do. The only thing about doing the podcast every week is I never get a vacation. And if I do, obviously I do. I do go on vacations, but I never get a week off in that. And I have to have a show ready for every week. Every single week, there's got to be a show ready. And so I have to earn my time off by getting ahead, by doing extra shows and getting extra work done. So yeah, that's a bit challenging. But the problem is I'm a victim of my own success. I've gone 18 years without missing a week. I'm not going to let myself do it now. You know what I mean? It's a long record, and so I have a huge motivation not to break that record. But again, it's not that hard to do. It's just planning. It's like you have to plan. There's no spontaneity. You have to plan ahead. It's like, okay, this is coming up. I got to get an extra show in the can so I could take that week off. Or I have a laptop. I might have to get up on a Saturday morning when I'm on vacation and do post-production on the show. It's not a big deal. It's just part of being an academic.
Well, Stephen Novella, this has been a pleasure and incredibly informative. And as always, you never disappoint. And I want to thank you so much for being a part of Skeptical 2022. And I hope we get you every year for that.
Well, it was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me. Again, I will do my best to try to get out there in person one year. But thanks for agreeing to pre-record the talk. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, it was our pleasure.